Right, I'm going to make a prompt start because we have a guest with us today who's a busy guy, and he's agreed to stick around for the actual lecture, which will mean that when we do the Q&A, he's familiar with the issues we've been talking about here, because today we're talking about construction, site matters, quality control, and then claims. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Dave Harding, who will come round in a minute. I won't make you sit up here all the way through. So Dave is in charge of the construction company that is building the student residences down at Greenbank and various other projects. It's an interesting story. The University of Liverpool are unique in having basically their own construction company, and that means that they can do joined up thinking, because most times the contractor is not on your side, but in this case everybody's working together. So it's a unique model around the UK, and but nevertheless Dave's background is very much from the commercial sector, working for ordinary external contractors, and he just has joined the university team. How many years ago, Dave? 5?
6 years.
6 years ago. Okay, so I'm going to get started, and this is actually the last lecture which covers subjects. The final one, which is actually after the Easter break, is a sweep up. So it's kind of handy insofar as you will have all the information you need if you want to spend time looking at stuff over the Easter break. It also might help you with the dreaded posters. So, what are we covering today? So we're going to be talking about construction issues, and that includes buildability. We're going to talk about how architects have to put really quite good specifications together and drawings if they're going to get what they really want on site. We're then going to speak a little bit about what happens when you go to a building site. What are you looking for? What's expected of you? How do you conduct yourself? We'll do a little tiny bit about payments and valuations, just so that you understand the system. And then the horror, which is claims. So when you're working in the real world, if you make a mistake or if there's some ambiguity and the contractor hadn't anticipated certain things are going to cost a certain amount of money, then they come back and try and claw back the money it's costing them to sort it out. And this is quite an embarrassing time for an architect, because you're sort of laid bare in front of the client with a contractor saying, well, look, this is costing me another 200,000, you need to pay me. And so that sometimes leads to alternative dispute resolutions. It sometimes ends up in court. It's something which is every architect's horror. Fortunately, it's rare. Individually, I've never had that happen to me, but across the whole country there are many cases, and in this university there's at least one case that I know of. So that's what we're going to cover. The library job I talked about at the beginning of these lectures, that went quite smoothly, but that was really because we were quite an experienced practice. We set everything up properly, we did really good detailed drawings and specifications, and we chose a contractor carefully that we knew was going to play fair, had expertise, and would bring something to the table. We then spent a lot of trouble going down there each week to make sure that things were on track, and when problems occurred, we jumped on them really, really quickly. So, in terms of getting things built, it's the old adage of wanting it on time, on budget, and to the right quality. The three things which we're always talking about. In terms of communications, it'll be interesting to hear from Dave how he sees it, that he's at the other end of the system. After I finished university, after I did my second degree, I worked for a construction company for a year on site as a site engineer. So all of a sudden I was having to read architects' drawings and try and fathom what was being required and look at the tolerances, and it gave me a different insight into how things work. The timely issuing of information is something we're going to talk about. Because if you let the contractor down by issuing stuff late, then he legitimately would say, well, look, I'm being caused delay here. It's not my fault. We're going to finish this job late. It's your responsibility as an architect to produce drawings that, details that are buildable. Now, it may well be there'll be people in the office you're working next year who are very experienced and can put you straight on things. With the university, having their own construction company means that Dave will actually comment on details and suggest to the architect that a different way might be just as well in terms of creating the quality they want, but a different way of doing it. Coordination, I've told you this before, but it's very, very likely next year you will be doing the coordination because it's something that you already have the skills to do. The coordination of the structure and the M&E and all those sorts of things. Monitoring jobs on site is something which you may go along as an observer but requires a lot of skill, and even architects after 5 years of experience can find this side of things tricky. And finally, choosing the right people. So when I say that the job that I showed you went well, it was definitely 50% down to the contractor. And most intelligent architects would admit that. It's a team effort, and it requires the contractor to work together with the architect and vice versa. So now a little bit more about communications. And some of these things you know, because you're already really good at doing drawings, and some of the things you don't. When you're issuing information to a contractor, there's a hierarchy of information. And that hierarchy of information you also sometimes get your tutors talking about in a review. So that we talk about doing general arrangement drawings and big sections. They will code into much more detailed information which show you how the buildings work. Those details will then code into a written specification, and that specification might be 200 pages thick, which explain what we actually mean by a 3mm thick aluminium cladding panel, and it will be there in a lot of detail. There then, on top of that, might be specification information from specialist suppliers, so that will be tagged into the specification document, and you may even have those suppliers on board before you get the contractor on board. So if you remember on that first project I showed you, we had that funny tube joining the new building to the old building, and the way in which those resin impregnated plywood panels worked, we had to check that we could bend them to certain radii, and we had to check how we fixed them in, because obviously when you try and bend something it wants to spring open. So we had to check with the supplier what the forces would be, and then the aluminium rails that held them beneath, we had to check with them that if we used a particular screw with a particular pull-out strength it would all work. And only when we got all of that information could we put that in the spec with confidence, because me as an architect couldn't work that out from first principles. I needed other people to help me with that. So we've already talked about programs. So there's two types of program. One is a master program, which very often the architect or the project manager would produce really early days, and it's got all the critical things happening and getting planning and how long it's going to take you to put the tender documents together and all that sort of stuff. And it will also have key flag points. When we've been working for this university, when we get to a particular stage and we want the client to sign it off, we know they can't just do that in a day. That has to be discussed at another level within the university, so it can easily take them 2 weeks to come back with an okay on the design we've done, and we need to build that into our master program. So that that program will also allow your boss at the architect's practice you work in to manage the resources in terms of office manpower, who's going to do what. Big projects require maybe a team of 3 or 6 people, and who's doing what, and that you've got enough people doing it becomes really, really important. So now I'm going to spin it round, and shortly we're going to ask Dave what his opinion is on this, about the contractor's perspective on information flow. So in terms of the construction programme, you will have all the key activities listed in a lot of detail. A contractor's programme is a very, very detailed thing, which is almost impenetrable to a regular person, and they provide simplified versions for architects and clients to look at. They will establish what's on the critical path. So Dave, just before I started this, was talking about delivery of bricks. Although bricks used to be easily available, they certainly aren't now. So that if they're on 6 months delivery, well, you need to know which brick you want, and you need to place the order 6 months in advance of them appearing. The contractor will also think very, very carefully about the sequencing of things, because things that you might think are going to appear at the end, actually, when the contractor looks at it, he may suss out that actually that's needed to be done much earlier, because you have to put that flashing thing in, because the brickwork is going to go past it. So they'll think very carefully about that. Now that is something that they have really good skills on, and we don't. So there's two things to remember there. Firstly, to involve the contractor as soon as you can. And secondly, to make the contractor responsible for the sequencing, not you, because if you try and guess at it, you could well get that wrong. In terms of the contractor's perspective on information flow, they have a dreaded document called an information requirement schedule. This is a really big, long list, and I would guess, how many pages would that be on Greenbank, Dave?
Well, it's an A3, portrait, so we could be looking at 3 pages.
3 pages of A3, okay? And this is a big, long list of what they want and when they want it. And a good contractor will issue this right at the beginning of the job. So right at the beginning of the job, you've got this big, long list. Some of them are needed week 1, some of them are needed week 4, and some of them are needed week 10. If you, first of all, when you get that, if the contractor's being unreasonable, you can say, whoa, just a minute now, you seem to be asking for everything on day 1. That's a bit unreasonable. Come on now, blah, blah, blah. But very often the contractor will have very good reasons for saying when they want stuff. And woe betide you, having agreed to that flow of information, if you're late with it. Because when you're late with it, it means the contractor can't place the order for the subcontractor or the materials, and it will cause a delay. That will then wing its way back to you. So when you're trying to explain to the client why the job is 2 weeks late, and you've got this little letter from a contractor saying, well, that's because they sat on their hands for 2 weeks and didn't give us the information when we wanted it. Well, the client will obviously take a very dim view, because it's obvious that you have not done your bit of the deal. In addition to that, there is then a sort of more regular thing, which is called an RFI, a request for information, RFI. And this is something that, as the job's going on, and they suddenly clock that they need to know how you're going to make the damp-proof course work with the paving, and no one's thought about it yet, they send you a little email, and it says, please send us the detail of how the DPM is going to meet with the paving slabs. And can you give us that in a week, please? And you have to issue that. So there's a lot of information whizzing around, and then there's another document called an information tracker. Now, a good contractor will have this and will look at it every time you have a site progress meeting and see how we're getting on. And nice, friendly contractors will have red, amber, green. And when it's red, it's serious, you're holding me up. When it's amber, it's just about coming up, and it's green, don't worry, we don't need it. We don't need it yet. A horrible contractor will just hit you with this thing at a site meeting and say, you are holding us up because you've missed a deadline here. We asked you for this and you haven't given it us. So that what this is all brought together in is a tracker. A tracker is something that you will come across in practice. It's basically a simple way in which you've got your list of things you're meant to do. You've got the things you've done, and you've got the things you've still got to do, and you just simply do a little update of where you're up to. They're very useful for planning applications because sometimes they're very complex requirements in planning applications, and you can track those. They're extremely useful for building projects. And even though architects grumble about these things, because obviously when you make a mistake, you get blamed and it's all very embarrassing. But actually, when I've dealt with poor contractors or very small contractors who perhaps aren't as organised, I have produced my own tracker. Because even though maybe the contractor hasn't been shouting at me that I'm slow giving him something, I need to know, and I need the office to know, so I will actually produce my own tracker. So the tracker is actually very much your friend, as long as, when you very first sit down with the contractor, that flow of information you feel is reasonable, and you know that you have the resources in the office to meet it. Because very often, architects and other professionals forget that they need 3 people working on a job in order to keep the information flow going. And once you get behind, it's absolutely fatal. So our perspective on the information flow is twofold. So first of all, before we send it out of the office, we need to know what's the status of the stuff you're sending out. Is it for comment? Is it for information? Is it for instruction? And who's produced it? So it's very, very likely in your very first job, you will not be given responsibility for sending anything out of the office until it's been checked by somebody. Now that person who's checking it, they may only be a year or so senior to you, or it may be a boss who's got 40 years experience, but someone will probably check it before it goes out. And of course, if the status of the information going out is for construction, if that was to go to Dave to build it, if there's mistakes in that, well then that's really bad news, because they are going to cause problems and delays. So once you issue it for construction, that's the final status, and you would need to give it a very, very careful look at to make sure that it's kosher. In terms of stuff coming into the office, it's almost as onerous. You need to decide, why is it being sent to me? Is it just so I can look at it and agree, yeah, it seems all right, fine, you know, a few bamboo shoots over there, that'll be great? Or is it the engineers sending it to you and saying, is this beam small enough so that you can get all your ducts underneath it? And if you miss why it's been sent to you, and if you forget to reply to him or you don't look at it carefully, and then when you come to build the building, the ceiling won't go in because the ducts are all hanging down too low, well, obviously, that's very embarrassing. So what's the status of the information? You're going to record when it's received, because there's a bit of a blame game that goes on sometimes. When things go in delay, everybody starts blaming each other. So you need another tracker to check when you got something and when you responded to it. And then you need to check who you're responding to. Now, it won't surprise you that in the brave new world that we all live in, this information flow on any sizable project all occurs in this cloud. And the cloud is an extraordinary thing because all of a sudden, people only have access to certain parts of it. So if Dave was running this project, he would, and he's the contractor and he's in control, he would have access virtually to every level within that cloud. But some of his subcontractors, who he doesn't want to see other things, he may only give access to certain places. The architect may also have access to only certain places. So first of all, someone has to decide who has access to parts of the system. In the cloud, it's also possible to put the status of these various documents, that this has been issued for construction, so that's the final stage, or this has been issued for comment, or this has just been issued for information. There's then a whole game about who has authority to mess around with these drawings. Now this becomes really tricky when you're dealing with Revit and BIM. And the whole business about who owns the model, The whole business of who can change things is a big deal. And because I'm very privileged to read a lot of case studies from top practices in London, I can tell you that cock-ups occur at every level. So I was interviewing a lady just 6 months ago where they had columns which were going to be clad in GRC, in glass reinforced concrete. And the engineer had not clocked what was going on and had just taken the size of the columns from the architect's drawing and made them work. The architect had assumed that they'd drawn columns indicatively, because every engineer is going to size a column for you. It's basic stuff. And by the time the thing started getting built on site, it was impossible to put the GRC cladding around the column and still get the wall panels in between each side. Massive, massive problem. And that was all to do with the ownership of the BIM model. That the structural engineer just took the initial model that the architect had done and just made it work. Whereas the architect expected the engineer to come back and slim those columns down, or at least have a conversation. So you also have to flag up changes. Now, whether you're in the cloud or whether you're in just ordinary paper world, if you change the size of a window down the bottom left-hand side of the elevation, Dave needs to know. You can't expect him, it's not like a Where's Wally competition, spotting which window has changed on the elevation. So you have to write in the column that this window 34 has changed from this size to that size. And then in the cloud, there will be a tracker which shows you the questions and answers that are floating around, all the communications that are going on. Now, although this system has been around probably for 10 years and has been widely used for 5 years, there's still some wrangles going on in the legal profession when problems occur, because it's new, and who has ownership of certain models is still being thrashed out in the court. So whatever you do when you work in your new practice, do what they tell you, because they will have taken a view on these things, and you'll have to decide, the office will decide how to deal with things. So the next little heading is buildability. Now there is something that you're a little bit familiar with, because sometimes in a review people will sort of ask you what it's made of, or they'll ask how it goes together, or how the roof joins onto the wall. And so it is with works on site. And when you're dealing with an intelligent contractor, then it's a two-way street and there will be a discussion. When you're dealing with an aggressive contractor, and there are still aggressive contractors around, I'm afraid, they will say, well, we'll never make that work. Never. We're on a 3-week delay already. Unless you send us another drawing showing how this is going to join to that, it's virtually tools down. And you can be put under pressure to try and sort this out. So obviously, within the office, you will deal with experienced people who understand sequencing of construction of components. I've already told you a story about some lights I specified for this university that were on long delivery because everybody went on holiday in Italy. So lead times can be embarrassing, particularly if you're on a traditional contract and you've specified something. Dirty operation, clean operation. So this is something where if your building is clad in the most beautiful marble, and that marble goes right the way down to the ground, and then you've got some paving coming up to it, but that marble has to go in early, well, poor old Dave has to wrap it up in bubble wrap, or else it's going to get knackered before you get the job finished. So the sequencing of things and thinking practically about guys with big boots and an angle iron on their shoulder has to be thought about. And in a joined up thinking world, you will take advice from the contractor as to how things can be done, because they are the experts. And finally, working at height. You had the lecture about health and safety, but as you're developing your design, you will start thinking about those things along with the buildability stuff. And when Dave is doing his job, it makes a big difference to him if he doesn't have to put temporary protection in. If, by the way, you've built a building, all the edge of every slab is naturally got a protective thing, or it's very easy to bolt some sort of rail on, that's great for him, because it can cost tens, if not hundreds of thousands of pounds to put protection all around a building so operatives can't fall off. And that's the way you have to do it. You can't just assume operatives won't go too near the edge. You've got to make sure that the stupidest operative can't possibly fall off the edge of that building. So now I'm going to talk about specification and detail. Now this is something that you really don't know much about, and in your early years you may still not get much experience about, but it's in real life it's very, very important. In some ways the written specification is sometimes more important than the drawn specification, particularly if you're doing design build projects. Remember, we've talked about how the contractor is in the driving seat, and you send them drawings that are really not much better than the drawings you pin up at a final review, so they're like planning drawings, and then you say to the builder, right, just build that. Now if you just did that and you had an unscrupulous builder, they would just do the cheapest building known to man, because they've only won the job because they put the lowest price in. So then they just lose cheap materials and they cheap windows and all the rest of it. So what you do is you write a very careful specification, which is called an employer's requirement document, and in there it will talk about standards, it will talk about products you're going to use, it will talk about how they're to be put together. And so even though your drawing is a bit vague, just like the ones you pin up at final reviews, Dave is tied into a really carefully written specification which says how he is to build that building. And that then allows a control over quality. Now there's still argy-bargy goes on, where the contractor comes back with bright ideas about how to save money, but at least you have a datum against which to work. So experience is everything. Involving manufacturers is crucial if you're using certain products, even simple products like single membrane roofs, flat roofs. You always work in accordance with the recommendations and their specifications. And there's this document called the National Building Specification, NBS. And this is the sort of one Bible for architects, the NBS. With any luck, you might come across it in your year out. It appears to be daunting, it appears to be super boring, but actually it's a brilliant checklist which forces you to think about things. So you might be just doing something about how a timber rafter joins on to the top of a wall in an ordinary house. How does the timber rafter join on to the top of the wall in an ordinary house? And you're looking at wall plates, it's called. And you just go, wall plate. And up pops about 5 pages, all about what the wall plate's made of, how it needs to be strapped down to the wall beneath it, how it's going to be fixed, how the rafter's going to be fixed to the wall plate, etc., etc., etc. And you have to choose, and it's like a prompt. So the NBS is a very, very important document in the real world when you're going out to get things built. We obviously also know about the building regs. You heard about those, linking into codes of practice, linking into approved documents, and then obviously technical journals. And just as in college where we look at precedents, in practice you very often are pulling information from built projects in order to justify the approach you're taking. The very first project I showed you at the beginning of this lecture series, which was quite a clever, naturally ventilated building with cross ventilation. If you remember, I told you that we researched to death naturally ventilated buildings, and we discovered that there have been a number of building failures because when it's very, very windy, the wind could get in or it could make horrible noises as it came through the baffles, and we were very nervous about that in a library because sound is important. And so we were learning from everything that's gone on before us. Now I have mentioned about this before, the idea of offloading responsibility. And this is definitely a thing in practice. It sounds a bit defensive, and to some extent it is, but it's also a positive thing where you benefit from all the expertise that are out there. So firstly, it's dead easy to get specialist suppliers to help you finish the specification. So if you're using some of those natural vent cowl things that you can just buy off the shelf, exactly how they work and to the extent to which they will ventilate a space All the information is there. The company who make them will help you and write you a specification. In order to do that, we need to make sure that they've seen everything to do with the issue you're showing them, because otherwise they'll give you some help, but later on they'll say, oh, well, I didn't know it had this sort of a flaw or something. So it's a bit like when you fill in an insurance document and you withhold some information. Guarantees can be very, very important, and they sometimes have strings attached. So if you're getting a guarantee on a roof, you might have to get them to come and look at that roof twice during construction if they're going to give you a guarantee. So that you are going to try and make sure that your drawings cover the things that you are responsible for. I told you a story about the balustrade that I hadn't got checked by the structural engineer, and the embarrassment when the building regs guy condemned it. And that was my fault for not sharing that information with the structural engineer, getting him to say it was okay. And sometimes you have to use specialist consultants. The favourite is acoustics. I know you've had lectures on all this. I wouldn't dream of doing some of the things that you are asked to consider in those lectures. I would backhill that to a specialist, because when you make a mistake on acoustics, it's a very expensive mistake. When you make a mistake in terms of impact sound between the floor, the flat above and the flat below, and you're just about to hand the building over, they will say, when they do the test, they'll say, no, you can't hand the building over because it doesn't work. So then you're in a serious delay situation, getting contractors in to try and do remedial work at somebody or other's expense. So acoustics is a classic where you involve a specialist in order to solve the problem. So now I'm going to talk about site monitoring. Now, firstly, we need to remember the two main procurement routes. The traditional route, where we send them out to tender, we're monitoring the job, we're contract administrator, and the architect is very much in the driving seat. And the other, which is design build, where the contractor is very much in the driving seat, the architect is just doing whatever he's told. Now, if you're in the first one, then there's no question. You're there to monitor quality, go down to site, make sure things are being done roughly in accordance with what you want, and flag up any problems. If you're in the second category, the contractor may never ask you to go to site ever. They might have the site progress meetings in another building entirely. They might tell you, I don't want you wandering around site telling me what's not right. I'm not paying you for that, I've got somebody else to do that. Or they may choose to use you for certain limited services of monitoring and flagging up issues. But just supposing you're on a design build contract and you see something that doesn't look right, that they're using the wrong brick, or they're not doing the jointing very well, it's not your place to phone up the client and say, that builder's using the wrong bricks and he's not building it right. Because the person who's paying you is the contractor. So you're going to, by all means, tell the contractor, send them a little email, say, whoa, doesn't look like those bricks are right, what are you doing there, you know? So you have a very different role if it's traditional or if it's design build. But let's just consider the traditional role. Firstly, even on a traditional role, you are not there to supervise the work. So Dave has got 30, 40 years experience of managing jobs on site, of managing the operatives who do the work, and he knows where all the problems are. You will have lots of experience in designing beautiful buildings and putting things together. You do not want to tiptoe into his realm, because otherwise you will not do it very well, and in any case you have no authority to tell operatives on site what they should and shouldn't be doing. You'd need to grab the site agent or the site manager and say, oh, I don't think they should be doing that, could you have a word with them? Of course, you're not there all day, every day. You're there once a week, and that's recognised by the courts, so that you will carry out periodic inspections. You may well ask for something to be opened up so you can have a look at it. You can just do your best at seeing what's going on the day you do your site visit. You can't be expected to see everything. However, you are there to check that they're roughly on programme. So if you knew that that wall was meant to be built week 4, and you're in week 6 and there's no sign of it, well, oof, that doesn't look very good. What's going on? Is there a problem? Is that critical? You might flag that up. And I've talked about the quality issue. If you're not happy with the quality, you'll flag it up for the contractor. Sometimes, there's no question, contractors use the wrong materials. Did any of you come to the thing where all the ladies talked about architecture? Did any of you come to that? Yeah. Well, do you remember that lady? My God, she's a tough case, wasn't she? The lady from Ellis Williams, who in her very early years of practice was doing a major job at Widnes, and the contractor was using the wrong rails to build all the elevations. And she wanders onto site and rather meekly says, "Whoa, you sure those are the right rails? They don't look right to me." And this guy, very patronising, says, "Oh, don't worry about it, love. We do it all the time. We've done hundreds of these. Just, don't worry about it." She went back to the office. She'd taken photographs. She checked. She'd measured the rails. She got her boss. They looked at what was what. And sure enough, these guys were using seriously the wrong rails that were not man enough to deal with wind loading. She went back to site and said, "I'm sorry, but you've done 2 whole floors of the elevations and you're using the wrong rails, and I want it stripped out and I want the correct rails put in." Of course, they had to adhere to that, and it cost them a fortune. And you can obviously, the point the lady made at the evening was that they didn't question her judgment again. She was very annoyed that they were very patronising to her, because this is a few years ago now, and they were patronising her because she was a lady architect. Anyway, you're there to check that things are being done correctly, and sometimes they're not, and it may just be a genuine mistake. You're going to check that your details that you put all that trouble in are roughly being followed, or if they're not, you're going to ask why. And very likely, as you wander around, you'll have the site manager or site agent wandering around with you. So someone like Dave will come round with you, and that's so that you can have a chat about the problems that are occurring. You'll be able to discuss the best way of solving a problem that no one foresaw, and how we're going to overcome that. And in any joined-up thinking world, it's a team effort, and you'll try and overcome these problems together. And well over 3/4 of the jobs I've been responsible for, I've had a good working relationship with the contractor, and we've overcome problems together. The quarter where I haven't has normally been because the contractor is losing money and they're looking to blame somebody, they're looking to claw things back.